Hopefully section 2.3 is still under the topic of review topics. You've seen linear inequalities before. An inequality is just something that is not an equal sign. So for example, the inequalities could be less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. That's how you read these. If you see the little n first, that's less than. If it has this line underneath, then that's going to be equal to, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. A linear inequality in one variable is an inequality that can be written in the form ax plus by is greater than 0, where a cannot be 0. The symbol, the inequality, may be replaced or interchanged with any of the other inequality symbols. Inequalities can have an infinite number of solutions or no solution. The set of solutions can be expressed using interval or set notation, and I'll show you what both of those look like. You solve inequalities just like you solve equations. You can add to both sides, subtract to both sides, multiply both sides by the same thing, or divide both sides by the same thing. The only thing different that you've got to keep in mind, the only thing you have to be aware of, is that if you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to flip the direction of the inequality. For example, we know that 1 is less than 2, but if I multiply both sides by a negative number, by a negative 1, which one is bigger, negative 1 or negative 2? Negative 1 is bigger, so the big end opens up at the negative 1. If you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to flip the inequality. So we're going to solve this inequality using the properties that we use for solving equations. The goal is to get the x by itself on the left. If you get the x by itself on the left, then the inequality will point in the direction of your solution. So I start with trying to get the 2x by itself. So that means I need to subtract 6 from both sides of the inequality. And when I do that, I get 2x is greater than or equal to 10 minus 6 is 4. I don't flip the inequality if I'm subtracting, only if I multiply or divide by a negative. To get the x by itself, then I divide both sides by 2. And that gives me, my solution is x is greater than or equal to 2. If I were to graph the solution on a number line, I'm just going to put 2 right here. Would I use a parenthesis or a bracket on 2, or an open circle or a closed circle on 2? It'd be a closed circle, and would I shade to the left or to the right? The inequality points in the direction that you shade if your x is on the left. So this would be my solution. The way I would represent that in interval notation, by the way, this is a graphical solution. If I asked you for your answer in interval notation, I would say that my solution is going to be the set of numbers that goes from 2 to infinity. I put a bracket on the 2 because x can be equal to 2, and I put a parenthesis on the infinity because we're never equal to infinity. This is my answer using interval notation. If I wrote my answer using set notation, it would look like this. It's going to be the set of x's given the condition that x is greater than or equal to 2. So you can write your answer using set notation, inequality, a graph, or interval notation. You need to be familiar with all of these. On the next problem, we observe that we have fractions in our inequality. How did we solve equations when we had fractions? What's the first thing that we did? We got rid of the fractions. How did I get rid of the fractions? Multiply both sides by the LCD. We're going to do the same thing here. What is my LCD for this problem? 3. So what I do to one side of the inequality, I have to do to the other. Because the left-hand side of the inequality is a fraction, I'm going to write 3 as a fraction. So that's t plus 2 over 3 is greater than or equal to 5. And I multiply the left-hand side and the right-hand side by 3. When I do that, these 3's cancel out, and I'm left with t plus 2 is greater than or equal to 15. Don't forget to multiply this side by 3 as well. How do I get the t by itself? I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. Do I have to flip my inequality? No, I don't. And I end up with t is greater than or equal to 13. What would my answer look like if I asked you to give me my answer in interval notation? Would I start with a parenthesis or a bracket? I'd start with a bracket. And then what? 13, comma, infinity, parenthesis. So my solution set, because it's a set, I'm using these brackets, would be the interval that goes from 13 off to infinity. If I wrote my answer using set notation, it's going to be the set of t's given the condition that t is greater than or equal to 13. I just used the inequality here. This vinculum, which is the fancy word for this vertical line, this vinculum means our answer is going to be all of the t's that given this condition that t is greater than or equal to 13. Both of these answers say the same thing. I don't know what you're going to encounter in the future, so I'm just showing you two different ways to represent the same answer. On number 22, we're asked to solve this inequality. What's the first thing I need to do here? Distribute the negative, and when I distribute the negative, that's going to give me 5 minus 2 plus 3x is less than or equal to negative 5x. Now I said when you're solving inequalities you always want to put your variable on the left so that the inequality points in the direction of your answer. So I want to put my x's on the left and my numbers on the right. But looking at the problem, it might be easier to do the opposite, put the x's on the right and solve for the numbers. Is that what y'all want to do? Is that what you would do? Probably. So we're going to solve it that way. First thing we do is we combine our like terms. So when we combine our like terms on the left, we get 5 minus 2 is 3 plus 3x is less than or equal to negative 5x. If I want to move the x over, I'm going to subtract 3x. Do I have to flip my inequality now? Not when you're adding or subtracting. That's going to give us 3 is less than or equal to negative 8x. How do I get the x by itself? Now do I flip my inequality? Because I divide by a negative, I have to flip that inequality, and that's going to give me negative 3/8 is greater than or equal to x. I said it's easier to read your answer and what you're supposed to do if you write the x on the left. So if I move the x to the left and the negative 3/8 to the right, will this point to the right or to the left? It'll point to the left because the little end here was pointing to the x. When you swap this so that the x is on the left, the little end still has to be pointing to the x in order to maintain the same solution set. So this is your answer written as an inequality. How would I write it using interval notation? I was told I would write parentheses, negative infinity, comma, negative 3/8 bracket, and that is absolutely correct because our solution is going to be all the x's to the left of negative 3/8 going off to negative infinity. Whenever you're using interval notation, you have to put the smallest value first, then the largest value in your interval. If I write my answer using set notation, it would look like this. It's going to be the set of x's given the condition that x is less than or equal to negative 3/8. When an inequality is multiplied or divided by a negative, you've got to flip the inequality. Look at this one. I have a fraction in it. What do I want to do first? Get the fraction out. So I'm going to multiply by my LCD, which is equal to negative 3. Are we okay with that? So I multiply the left-hand side of the equation by negative 3, and I multiply the right-hand side of the equation by negative 3, but because the right-hand side is a fraction, I'm going to write negative 3 as a fraction. So that gives me negative 3 times 2x minus 3 is less than or greater than. I multiplied by a negative. You've got to flip your inequality. Don't forget to do that. So that's going to be greater than negative 3 over 1 times the right-hand side x plus 2 over negative 3. Then we're going to distribute the negative 3 over here, and we're going to cancel the negative 3's right here. When I distribute the negative 3, that gives me negative 6x plus 9 is greater than, and it's greater than because I multiplied by a negative. I had to flip the inequality. These are going to cancel out, and I'm left with x plus 2 on the right hand side. Do I want my x's on the left or on the right? I want them on the left, so I'm going to subtract x from both sides to move the x over, and subtract 9 from both sides to move the 9 over. And when I do that, I end up with negative 7x is greater than negative 7. How do I get that x by itself? Divide both sides by negative 7, and that means I've got to flip my inequality. So I end up with, for my solution, x is less than 1. If you wrote this using interval notation, it would be the set of values that go from negative infinity to 1 and both of those get parentheses. If I wrote it in set builder notation, it would be the set of x's given the condition that x is less than 1. On part B, what do I want to do first? I've got parentheses with negatives out front. I want to distribute, so I'm going to distribute a -3 here and distribute the negative here. When I do that, that gives me -12z. By the way, I cross my z's because otherwise they look like 2's. -12z plus 12 is greater than or equal to 4 minus z plus 1. I have like terms that I can combine on the right hand side, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that's going to give me -12z plus 12 is greater than or equal to 5 minus z. Do I want my variables on the left or on the right? So I'm going to add z to both sides of the equation to move it, and I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides of the equation to move the constants. When I do that, that gives me -11z is greater than or equal to 5 minus 12 is -7. Is that right? How do I get the z by itself? Divide by -11. What you do to one side you have to do to the other, but because we divided by a negative, I've got to flip that inequality. So that means my final answer is going to be z is less than or equal to 7/11. If I wrote that answer using interval notation, it would go from -infinity to 7/11 with a bracket on the 7/11. And if I wrote it using set builder notation, it would be the set of z's given the condition that z is less than or equal to 7/11. You use a bracket when there's an equal to. You use a parenthesis if it's a strict inequality. Good point. The last thing we're going to talk about is compound inequalities. A compound inequality occurs when two inequalities are connected by the word and or. If the word and is used, the conditions of both inequalities must be satisfied to make it true. These inequalities are often written as three-part inequalities. For example, we have x is greater than or equal to 40 and x is less than or equal to 70. That means that x has to be greater than or equal to 40 and less than or equal to 70. In a compound inequality, you have your variable by itself in the middle, and then your solution will be between these two numbers. Here, we're asked to solve the following inequalities and write the solution set in mathematical notation. The goal is to get the x by itself in the middle. Right now, I have 5x plus 1 in the middle. I want to get the variable by itself. How do I move the 1 off? Subtraction undoes addition, but if you subtract it from the middle, you've also got to subtract it from the other two parts. When you have an equation or just a plain old inequality, you got to do the same thing to both sides. With a compound inequality, there's three parts. You've got to do the same thing to all three parts. So -4 minus 1 is -5 is less than or equal to 5x is less than 21 minus 1 is 20. How do I get the x by itself? Do I have to flip any inequalities? And what I do to one part, I have to do to the other parts, so I end up with -1 is less than or equal to x is less than 4. How would I write this answer using interval notation? Would I start with a parenthesis or a bracket? And then what? And then what? And then what? Parenthesis. Why is it a parenthesis on the 4? It's a strict inequality. Right. Now, this is true if you have a smaller number on the left, larger number on the right, and a variable in the middle. You would just put your solution set being between these two values. If you have the equal to here, you use a bracket. If it's a strict inequality, use a parenthesis. There's no need to flip it because I have the smaller value on the left. Oh, I didn't divide by a negative number. It was positive, so I don't have to flip anything. I can subtract all day long without flipping any inequalities. Multiplying or dividing by a negative causes you to flip. All right, on part B, I have a compound inequality with fractions. What's the first thing I want to do? And what is my LCD equal to? So I have three sections on this problem. All three sections are going to get multiplied by 4. In the first section I have a fraction. In the second section I have a fraction, so I'm going to write 4 as a fraction. And in the third section I don't have a fraction, so I'm going to leave it alone. Then I just drop down my problem. I have 4 times 1/2 is less than 1 minus 2t over 4 is less than 2. Then I just simplify. Here 2 goes into 4 2 times. These 4's are going to cancel out, and that's not a fraction. When I clean this up, then I end up with 2 is less than 1 minus 2t is less than 8. How do I get the t by itself? What do I need to do? Subtract 1 from all three parts. What you do to one part, you have to do to the others. Then that's going to give us 1 is less than negative 2t is less than 7. How do I get the t by itself? Divide by what? And what you do to one part, you got to do to all three parts. But now I've divided by a negative, so what else do I have to do? You have to flip your inequalities. So these become greater thans. Now I end up with negative 1/2 is greater than t is greater than negative 7/2. Which one of these numbers is smaller? Negative 7/2 or negative 1/2? Negative 7/2. And I said for the compound inequality you need to have the smaller value on the right and the larger value on the left. Well, if I flip these endpoints here, that relationship between t and that number has to be the same. So between the negative 7/2 and the t, the big end of this inequality is facing the t. Between the negative 7/2 and the t, the big end is facing the t. Between the t and the negative 1/2, the little end is facing the t. So this is going to look like this, and that would be your answer using an inequality or set builder notation. How would I write my answer using interval notation? Parentheses, not a bracket, because I don't have an equal to. Negative 7/2, comma, negative 1/2, parentheses, and that would be my final answer. One last problem and then we are done for the week. Once again, I've got three fractions. What is my LCD going to be equal to here? 6. It's not 3 because 2 won't cancel with 3. It's 6 because both 2 and 3 go into 6. So I multiply all three sections by 6. And what I'm writing in red is the change that I'm doing. What I write in blue is the original problem. So that's 1/2 is less than or equal to 1 minus 2t over 3 is less than 2/3. Then we come along and cancel. 2 goes into 6 how many times? 3 goes into 6 how many times? And then 3 goes into 6 2 times. When we clean this up, we write down what's left over. I get 3 is less than or equal to 2 times 1 minus 2t is less than 4. Any questions? 2 times 2 is 4. This 2 is multiplied across these parentheses, so I've got to keep it in parentheses until I'm ready to distribute. So that's going to give me 3 is less than or equal to 2 minus 4t is less than 4. How do I get the variable term by itself? What you do to one part, you have to do to all three parts. Subtract 2 from all three parts. And that's going to give us 1 is less than or equal to negative 4t is less than 2. How do I get the t by itself? Divide all three parts by negative 4. But what else do I have to do when I divide by a negative? I've got to flip the direction of that inequality. So this becomes negative 1/4 is greater than or equal to t is greater than negative 1/2. This is not written in order where the smaller numbers on the left and the larger numbers on the right. To rewrite this, I flip this and I get negative 1/2 is less than t is less than or equal to negative 1/4. Notice the direction of this inequality between t and negative 1/4 is the little ends pointing to the t. That didn't change. This is your answer. In interval notation, how would I express this? Start with a parenthesis or a bracket. Parentheses, negative 1/2, comma, negative 1/4, bracket. Y'all have got it. Y'all have a great weekend.